and welcome to this webinar. My name is Barbara Rosen-Jacobson, and I am an advocacy advisor for Mercy Corps and the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. In case you don't know us yet, we're an alliance of 9 organizations. You'll see the logos on the slide, and we combine humanitarian, research, private sector expertise, and really work together to enhance flood resilience. Today, we are discussing the launch of a new report that we produce as the Alliance on resilient recovery. And we really noticed that with the accelerating climate crisis, it just becomes increasingly vital to incorporate resilience into any recovery effort, because building back to pre-disaster states is just not good enough anymore. And at the same time, we are seeing very limited progress on resilient recovery, which was also something that was highlighted by the Sendai review. So what we did is we built on case studies in Nepal, in Mexico, and in Senegal to really better understand the importance of building back better in the recovery phase and the mechanisms to implement resilient recovery and what is blocking these mechanisms. And as such, the report includes recommendations both for national governments and for the international community to make resilient recovery a reality. So during this webinar, we will first have a keynote speech presentation from Ronald Jackson. He's the head of the Disaster Risk Reduction Recovery for Building Resilience at UNDP. And he's one of the key proponents of building back better in the world. So we're very happy that he's here with us. We will then have a short panel discussion with a presentation from Karen McClune. She's the CEO of ISET, and ISET is one of our partners in the Alliance. And she and her team has led on the research for this report. And she will be followed by Dharam Upreti. He's the thematic lead on climate and resilience at Practical Action Nepal. And he conducted one of the 3 case studies from the report. So it will be very interesting to hear a more national perspectives from him. And after these presentations, we will have about 15 minutes for a discussion with you. And we would be very happy to answer your questions and generally to listen to your thoughts and perspectives on resilient recovery. We've noticed it's an incredibly wide-ranging multi-stakeholder effort, so I'm sure you all have something to bring in. So feel free to add your questions or perspectives in the Q&A section, which you can find here on Teams. During the webinar so that we can already capture them. And finally, to close the webinar, we will have concluding remarks from Debbie Hillier. She's the head of the Zurich Alliance at Mercy Corps. Without further ado, over to you, Ron.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Let me also add my words of welcome to the participants and to our panelists, but also to thank the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance for the invitation to mark this launch of the Alliance's new report, Enabling Transformation from Recovery to Resilient Recovery, which focuses on breaking the cycle of disasters and growing inequality. It's also important to note here that the report further stresses the importance and value of prioritizing and pre-planning resilient recovery to ensure the affected population, wherever they are able to face climate threats. And I would say, that investment certainly will redound to them facing any other shocks and threat now and in the future, and to recover from these in a resilient way. But even as we use this term, resilient recovery, and we seek to picture what this actually looks like, a few things for us to consider. We believe that when we consider resilient recovery, we are looking at governments that have in place strong, effective, and inclusive recovery institutions to provide at all levels the necessary framework, tools, and resources within which to formulate and implement policies, to understand how the recovery mission should be managed, and to build trust and accountability and transparency within the process amongst the population and the wider stakeholder. We also believe that good resilient recovery really has in place robust programs that foster what we call preparedness for recovery. And this is recovery that is not seen as an afterthought, but planned for, especially in the context where risks are high. As we picture, we also envisage that there should be the appropriate financing arrangements, financing agreements, and protocols in place to be able to drive this process, and that interventions, when deployed, leads to a reduction in vulnerability and exposure, and certainly strengthen the capacities of individuals, communities, institutions to be able to deal with the next adverse event that they could face. More importantly, it should really seek to address the broken development pathways to restore those points of failure, but more importantly, make them much, much more stronger or resilient, as we've said. And of course, that the emerging society comes out of these events more resilient, spanning from national to municipal to community to the individual, but also rippling across all sectors. Based on UNDP's own experience, we have curated a number of recovery experiences globally, and we've identified a set of principles and approaches that have been applied and that have yielded positive results. The following principles should be kept in mind to ensure recovery programs promote resilience. And of course, these are very much enshrined within UNDP's own policy documents, which guides its investments or interventions on recovery-related portfolios. For example, one, we believe one of the principles should be to promote national ownership, leadership, and capacity building by supporting national actors to lead, manage, and monitor the recovery process. Two, that community participation and empowerment are essential, that people are at the center of recovery programs. The participation of communities in decision-making, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation is vital. It will increase the suitability and sustainability of recovery interventions. Further, we believe in transformational inclusion. So recovery efforts are inclusive, equitable, non-discriminatory, and they must address the needs of the disadvantaged groups with a view to leaving no one behind. These aren't simply buzzwords. These are, I would say, imperatives. This we know is at the center of the transformative promise behind the 2030 agenda, for sustainable development. Further, we need to also safeguard human rights. Recovery efforts must use a human rights-based approach and be implemented in conformity with international human rights standards, recognizing that disasters can further exacerbate inequalities and lead to further discrimination amongst the most vulnerable and marginalized, requiring dedicated support to foster their inclusion. Another principle we promote is that we foster conflict sensitivity, conflict prevention, and sustaining peaceful societies. This ensures that recovery activities not only do no harm, but also foster social cohesion and the relegitimization of the state-society contract, thereby addressing systemic risk and inequalities. There should be transparency and accountability. This is owed not only to governments and donors, but also to the beneficiaries themselves. And we should strive for gender equality and women's empowerment as part of the process. More importantly, and as we reflect on the current climate crisis, we need to ensure that the principle of green and environmental sustainability approaches are built into the solutions that we promote. Recovery efforts that recognize the close interdependencies between human life and environmental health can address systemic risk. Finally, the principle of promoting a risk-informed recovery. Effective recovery is premised on robust, timely, and actionable data and analysis to inform the programming and the development pathway going forward. The adherence to these principles will provide the foundations for us to build back better, Some say build back forward. These are essentially, for me, synonymous. The central tenet here is this concept. In this concept is to avoid what I call the tyranny of the urgent, but rather to focus on a transformative approach that seeks to remove past points of failure and instill resilient systems. For those who don't know, Building Back Better as defined by UNDRR and the UN General Assembly in 2016 is the use of the recovery, that is rehabilitation and reconstruction phase after disaster, to increase the resilience of nations and communities through integrating disaster risk reduction measures into the restoration of physical infrastructure and societal systems, and into the revitalization of livelihoods, economies, and the environment. Inherent in UNDRR's and the UN General Assembly's definition is the reorientation of development pathways during the recovery process. What is possible ex-post disaster is intrinsically contingent on what existed ex ante, and building back better is predicated on a willingness to change while preserving what is valued and on the wherewithal to do so. So therefore, the concept of BBB, Building Back Better, is approached by UNDP from 4 lenses. 1, building back holistically, and this includes the integration of systems building. The process is guided by recovery assessments, vulnerability assessments, and information management systems to inform the development of recovery plans, appropriate institutional and financial arrangements, and the identification and prioritization of suitable recovery interventions. Most importantly, not forgetting the whole of government and the whole of society approaches. So we're looking at the whole issue of governance here as fundamental and foundational. Second, building back safer and smarter. That is applying knowledge, innovation, and technology solutions where possible. Communities, governments, planners, and private sector actors all need awareness and understanding of the hazards they face, as well as the actionable information about how to reduce their exposure and vulnerability, critical elements of that risk equation that we need to address as we seek to advance a Building Back Better agenda. Data-enabled decision support tools, particularly multi-hazard risk mapping, are gaining in sophistication and in use in disaster risk management, powered by advances in ICTs, with enormous investments also in the analytical groundwork that must be laid to advance these processes. Next, building back fairer. Here we look at equity and inclusion, identifying and incorporating the needs and aspirations of a range of population groups who are marginalized. This is key. Entry points exist in multiple domains, from the legal domain, the cultural domain, the technological domain, as well as the economic, social, and institutional domain, which must be tackled all together to achieve the maximum effect. Building back more cost effectively assesses the financial implications of building back better choices, applying sophisticated tools that can help to directly quantify and look at the multiplier effects of the process going forward. Here, it is important to consider the cost of inaction and address uncertainty, looking at the fiscal space, absorptive capacity, and distributional considerations will be critical factors in determining the pathway ahead. Policies to reorient funding mechanisms from replacement to improvements are going to be critical in making inroads in recovery programs. And most importantly, managing trade-offs between resilient investment and debt accumulation while meeting current needs is at the heart of the financing efforts for Building Back Better, one of the main challenges. So what are some of the challenges we see in achieving resilient recovery? The recently completed midterm review, the Sendai midterm review done in 2023, highlight that in prioritizing speed, significant opportunities are missed to build back better. The Sendai midterm review also reports on a lack of sufficient progress on several dimensions that are important for the planning and implementation of what is priority 4 in the Sendai framework. And this is enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery. This includes governance, access to data, access to risk-relevant information, and flexible and predictable financing. The redress of the ingrained inequalities are also a component showing up in a lot of the assessments that were done across the region as one of the big challenges. And of course, funding arrangements for loss and damage are now falling short of responding to the current and future scale of the potential loss and damages that we see as a result of the climate change variable now at play. Final challenge, there's a limited range of technical capacities in several countries to lead and implement the large-scale recovery efforts that are required. Noting that recovery, it's not a short race, it's not a sprint, but really a marathon as we seek to address those development failures. Irrespective of the challenges there are, however, we see success stories. The housing sector is leading the way, with the journey from evacuation shelters to permanent dwelling often unfolding via transitional arrangements. This is well documented by Lyons and Schneiderman since 2010, and this has picked up momentum. Studies of housing reconstruction programs also show that the perceived trade-offs between speed and participation are not always as clear-cut as they seem, and we can look at the post-tsunami issues in Sri Lanka, where we saw contractor-built housing was slower than owner-built approaches. Some of the key takeaways, of course, as I seek to close, is recovery is not a business-as-usual approach. It is large-scale, complex, time-sensitive, requiring millions of dollars and diversity of technical capacities. Therefore, dedicated institutions, financing, policies, plans, and frameworks are needed to guide the recovery process, and that ensures sustainability and resilience are built thereafter. It requires strong anticipatory approaches that can help strike an appropriate balance between the pace of and delivery and the quality of recovery programs without key building blocks in place before a disaster strikes. The whats, the wheres, the whos, the whens, and the hows of building back better are almost certain to be drowned out in a cacophonic, helter-skelter crisis environment. The most critical starting point is to have the political will to take the necessary steps. This requires advocacy and a paradigm shift in the way recovery programs are looked at. That is, recovery provides an opportunity to build back better, incorporating risk management approaches. It is transformative, requiring short-term, long-term intersect to mitigate risk and build resilience and also preparedness. This is a key message from our viewpoint at UNDP, and I would like to close by leaving you with a quote from the government of India, where they've indicated integrating building back better approach in recovery improves the economic vitality and safety of the affected communities and provides opportunities to address vulnerabilities while increasing resilience in the long term. This integration can be achieved through advocacy, needs assessment, recovery planning and implementation, and improve accountability and transparency. I thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussions thereafter.
Thank you, Ron, for that really comprehensive and holistic overview of resilient recovery. And avoiding this tyranny of the urgent, I think that was particularly powerful. So we've already heard a lot of thoughts on resilient recovery, why it is important and what to do. And in our report, we try to structure these thoughts into frameworks based on country case studies in Nepal, Mexico, and Senegal, and turn these into recommendations for policymakers. So I'd like to invite Karen to present the main findings of the report and what these mean for policymakers. Over to you.
Thanks, Barbara. And I'm glad to be part of this. Thanks for those who have joined us today. So I want to start with just an explanation of how we arrived at this report, which is that the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance has been conducting something we call post-event reviews, using a methodology, the post-event review capability, that was developed in 2013. And at this point, we've conducted over 20 of these post-event studies around the globe. And what we do is we go in a few months after a disaster, once the immediate response phase has ended, and we look at why. Why did a natural hazard event become a disaster? Typically, these events are not highly unusual for the context. They could be predicted more or less, like this will happen eventually. And yet, there are substantial failures that result in disaster. And where's the opportunity? Where weren't things a disaster because things went well, and that can be built on? And where were the gaps that did result in things not going as planned or not being thought about at all that can be filled? And this report in particular focuses in on 3 studies that we've completed recently in Mexico, Senegal, and Nepal, and then goes deeper with those. That in the process of developing this report, we went back to those contexts. We conducted some additional interviews to say, we came in, we did a PERC, what's happened since? Where do we see that some of our recommendations have been acted on? Where do we see that things are happening differently or not? And so that's the real grounding. Next slide. And the reason that we wanted to do this report is because across all of the PERCs we've conducted, in every context, developing, developed, rural, urban, recovery is the forgotten element of the disaster risk management cycle. We see often reasonably strong or very strong preparedness, often on the basis of corrective risk reduction that was done, in response to previous events. Response is getting better and better globally, I think, and the recognition. And there's been an evolution in DRR and DRM. And really, we're now at the point where we need to get serious about recovery because we're not doing it well at all anywhere. What we do is we look at the physical landscape and recover that maybe fairly well to standards that were already there, but we completely miss the less visible, the livelihoods, the social fabric, the very heart of what makes a community, that often gets left out. Next slide. And so on the continuum of recoveries, from no recovery to recovery, we're picking up some of that. There are pieces that we aren't recovering at all. There are pieces that we're recovering to as was. And yet, if something has become a disaster, we already know that building back as was is insufficient. To address the things that we're seeing today, we need an enhanced recovery, and we know that that actually isn't going to be sufficient either. That climate is changing. We're seeing the risk landscape change as a result. We're complicating that further, often in the ways we build. We need to be thinking and moving much more toward a resilient recovery, a recovery that looks at not just what do we need to handle today, but what will we need to be ready for tomorrow. And it's only by building this in that we can get off the treadmill of continual recoveries, which are very expensive. There's an opportunity here to save ourselves money, to save a lot of pain and suffering by doing this well once, rather than by doing it repeatedly and repeatedly. Next slide. So how do we do this? In the report, we've divided this into 3 main elements, and we need all of them. It's not that we can do one and not pay attention to the others. Next slide. The first is that our recovery needs to be risk informed. And this is all going to sound very much like Ron's presentation. That we need to be looking at not just an event that happened, but a much broader look at what are the risks we need to be ready for. A recovery is an opportunity. There's a lot of funding that's freed up often. There's a lot of interest and political will. We can use this to recover in ways that don't just help with the thing we're recovering from now, but much more broadly. But we need to understand what that is and where those opportunities are. And so we need really clear risk mapping in advance, and we need that to think about compounding and cascading risks. We also need to think about future climate risks and how to layer those all in together. Next slide. Our recovery needs to be multidimensional. And this really speaks to the way that our recovery is so much focused on what we see right now. It's the physical landscape, it's the built structures, it's possibly recovery in some elements of sort of the natural systems. But we miss so much in terms of the social, the human, the environmental, and the financial factors. And those are often not expensive, but they take intentional thought, and they need to be built in intentionally into the recovery. And the people who are impacted by those need to be part of the recovery for them to be built in ways that actually work for them. And so that goes to the next point, next slide, which is that our recoveries have to be inclusive. And when we say that, we mean not just that we need to be thinking about these most vulnerable people, how will we deliver a recovery for them? They need to be part of the discussion about how this recovery will unfold, because by building in their priorities, you often get a very different recovery. When we go in and we conduct perks, they're multi-scalar. So we're talking to people at the highest levels of national government. We're talking to households. We're talking to small business owners. And what we hear on the ground is often a very different story from what we hear at higher levels of governance. And by including those very localized perspectives, there's the opportunity to shift the playing field in very meaningful and inexpensive ways that can then often enable people to better recover for themselves, to better spend their own money that they would invest into recovery, but also to set up the rules of the game and the other top-down funding flows to actually support them to recover in more enduring and effective ways. Next slide. So why isn't this happening already? If it's such a great idea and it will save us money, well, part of that, I think, is that we have been on a journey with DRM that not very long ago, the best thinking was to go in and provide food and aid and get people back on their feet. And we've come so much further with preparedness and with more thoughtful response. And now we're ready. Now we can. This is our next step. And it's not easy. It would be happening if it were easy. And one of the first places that we really need action is recovery needs to be pre-planned. And we don't like thinking in advance about the disaster that might happen. And so it's something that typically gets relegated to disaster risk managers. But once a disaster is hit, as Ron mentioned, that's not the time to be thinking about how you're going to recover. You need the relationships in place, you need the plans in place, so that things can flow, and you need to know how you are going to recover before you begin. If you want to include climate change information and the best climate science, you need to know it before that disaster hits. Because once the disaster hits and there's pressure to just get things back to normal, that's not when you're going to be doing that research. And pulling in those people and thinking about what it means for you and how you need to be building differently. And that needs all to be in place in advance. And then once you know how you are going to want to recover when you need to recover, you need the capacity on the ground to do that. And this capacity challenge is really significant pretty much everywhere. There's often very strong capacity at a national level. And then as you drop down in levels, it gets thinner and thinner until on the ground, you probably have one person wearing 3 or 4 hats that they're, they have a day job. And then, oh, when a recovery hits, they suddenly have to add that to their workload. If they're not ready, if they don't know what your plan is, if they don't know why they need to be thinking about climate change information and rebuilding differently, it will not happen. And so that capacity building at all levels needs to be part of your pre-planning, honestly. And then finally, it needs to be funded. People can't do anything if they don't have the funding to act. And the report talks about how funding can be layered, how to think about the pre-planning for funding. But again, as Ron mentioned, one of the key messages we found was it can't just be debt. That when we fund recovery simply with debt, people spiral further and further down. And so this funding needs to be thought about much more intentionally, both at the national level, but also at the international level. We need to think about how we're actually setting people up for failure when we fund them for their recovery using debt mechanisms. Next slide. And all 3 of those need to be iterative. We're not going to just do this once and then be done. Our climate is changing, our built landscapes are changing, our recovery plans are going to need to change. And every time we need to recover, either in a given location or anywhere in the country or even in neighboring countries, that's an opportunity to learn. So often when we've gone in and conducted perks, what we hear people say is, well, that was unprecedented and it will probably never happen again. That's probably not true anymore. If it ever was, that increasingly we need to look at highly unusual climate events as the warning signal. And we need to be ready for those, again, in our location, or if it happens somewhere else, we need to be thinking very critically about, could that happen to us? And when it does, are we going to be ready? And so as we do these planning processes and set these up, we need to set them up to learn, really actively learn in every phase. Next slide. The opportunity, if we do this well, is really building in equity. And in the process of the work that we did for the report and the literature reviews, and we found so many really powerful quotations that speak to why this needs to happen. Like, who is falling off the bottom and why are they falling off the bottom and how are they falling off the bottom? And it doesn't need to be difficult to address their needs. It just needs to be intentional. Next slide. So the overall takeaway, we have a full series of products that have come out, a full report of 40 or 60 pages. If that sounds a little daunting, we have a series of executive summaries in English, French, and Spanish, about 8 pages. And then we have the policy brief, 4 pages, which almost anyone can pick up and read. And each of those has recommendations for both national and international actors. Obviously, lighter in the policy brief, just the really key takeaways, but then a much more detailed and thoughtful set if you go to the full report. And all of these materials are available on floodresilience.net, and I believe are also being posted in the chat for this webinar. And then one final slide, which is that now is the time. We've come through an evolution in DRM work. We are at the point where we can see the need for resilient recovery. We see the pathways to achieving resilient recovery. We now need to just genuinely commit to doing that. We have to move away from the idea that Build Back Better is a catchphrase and just think about, okay, how are we going to make it real? But if we do that, it has the potential to save us money. The places that recover best are the places that recover frequently, but one could ask why? Why are they recovering frequently? Why have they not recovered in a way that prevents them from needing to recover again? And if you do that, you save so much money. So now is our time to put resilient recovery onto the national and international stage and really move. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen, for that call to action. This was a very clear and interesting presentation, and really provided this kind of global overview of what do we mean with resilient recovery, but obviously disasters impact people and recovery happens locally. So we're really happy that Dharam is with us to provide a perspective on resilient recovery in Nepal. Just flagging that we're a bit short on time, so if you can stick within your 10 minutes, that would be great. Over to you, Dharam.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I'm just talking about how resilient recovery leverages the expertise of the adaptation sector. Could you go to next? Yeah, I try to link how what are the the major objectives of adaptation. So 3 components are really essential to foster adaptation: building capacity, strengthening resilience, and reduce vulnerability. So those 3 components are essential, and Paris Agreement also aims to foster those as a part of that brought the global goal on adaptation. So linking those 3 components, and if we merge with the local-led adaptation, how our work actually support communities to build their resilience. So I've just bundled together our experience. If you go next, then of the time. We have looked a case of 2017 flood in Nepal, how those floods impact communities and what happened at that time, and then what we learned from those events. And then what we did was we did a post flood capability assessment, and then we learned. Can you go next? We learned rescue and relief could not be done effectively at that time. That resulted number of deaths, number of casualties, number of loss and damage at local levels, and then standard operating procedures and actions and roles and responsibilities were missing of the local government, local communities, and even the federal government. Then inadequate awareness leads to incorrect actions at local levels that led to more casualties, more loss and damage, and then inadequate time for reduce of at-risk people. And then a local capacity we found inadequate to the scale of the emergency that we observed in 2017 flood. And then local capacity and then weather forecast system that we had at that time was not communicated well enough before the disaster hit hard to the communities. Then more flood exercise that we realized is really important. That was missing, that capability at that time. And then prospective risk reduction was missing. And then impact-based forecasting, of course, was missing at that time. So those are the key learned that we drawn from the post-event review capability per 2017 after the 2017 flood. So what we realized next is, could you go next? Yeah. Then rescue and relief could not be done. Yeah. So that's what lessons are learned from 2017 per. We developed standard operating procedure for flood and link with local communities and local government. That means strengthening early warning system, community-centric early warning system, linking early warning system with local government, linking early warning system with federal government, and then build connection between local, federal, and provincial. That is one key takeaway from the 2017 part. And then strengthening risk communication. That was really essential that we realized. in 2017. So advanced single hazard-based risk communication to multiple channel of risk communication at local level via community, via media, and then different media include the social media as well. And then support establish local emergency operation center at local government. That means local emergency operation center is established at local level that foster risk communication. And more investment in ex-ante actions that was missing, that we realized missing before, for example, plantation in the bank of the river, and then biodiag and bioengineering measures, plantation movement at the local that control erosion from the river. Then build community capacity was really essential. And then what we did was we built capacity of the community, working with community disaster management committee, the micro level institutions that foster local capacity, that foster local communication systems, and then that, of course, reduce the risk. And then policy dialogue, we organized, linking local communities with local decision makers. That was really essential, and that we have been doing after that. Then one of the important thing is we integrate climate and disaster into one by facilitate to develop local disaster and climate resilience plan. We integrate both in one, and then that integrate into local decision-making process. Next. So there are a couple of examples what those adaptation measures are there, and that are the part of business as usual in this time. So store of the important assets, then drainage storage system, high-risk nurseries, and then the center during the emergency. So these are some of the examples how local communities are adapting to the flood risk. Next. Yeah, these are the, some natural-based solutions as a part of ecosystem-based adaptation that we have learned with communities. It's not a expensive technology. We can collaborate with local government, local communities to bring and to build such type of dike in the bank of river that control not only the flood but also rehabilitate the agricultural systems and ecosystem itself. Next. The third case is how communities manage, how communities produce the seedlings in order to build, the ecosystem in the bank of river. So community forest user groups is one of the vehicle that foster ecosystem-based adaptation. They build their capacity, they decide where to plant, how many plants, and what plant species they need to plant so that they could be helpful during and after disaster. Next. So these are the couple of examples how local adaptation actions support local resilience building. So raise hand pump, as I mentioned earlier, nurseries, even during the flood. So no business actually stopped even during the disaster. So that is what we learned, and that is what we integrate into local planning process. Next. Yeah, so what lessons we have learned by those? So adaptation actions should be based on local context and local knowledge, and community-centric co-creation approaches are instrumental for effective adaptation actions. For example, community-based early warning system, community forestry, and then local adaptation plan should reflect local needs and local well-beings. National adaptation plans to be formulated based on local co-creation approaches of adaptation, and people-centered end-to-end multi-hazard early warning system can support adaptation if they look beyond emergency responses. Thank you. Yeah, these are the some of the landscape how the government of Nepal has built for adaptation and recovery process. So a number of agencies are set up, but still we are struggling with building synergy, building connectivity between and among those institutions that foster local adaptation. Next. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dharam. And I particularly appreciated that last slide, which really shows how many different stakeholders are involved and how complex it is to coordinate resilient recovery. So thank you for that presentation. Also on the links between adaptation and resilient recovery, learning from the locally led adaptation principles, really building adaptation into the recovery phase and ultimately reducing risk for future disasters. So really thank you for that. We have the time for probably 1 or 2 questions, maybe even more if the questions are short. So feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat. We also received a couple of questions in the registration form. So if there are no questions from you, we can tackle those, but obviously we would like to hear from you first. So please raise your hand if you have a question. I'll just give you a minute to think this all through. And otherwise we will get to one of the questions that have been submitted. So if there are no questions yet, I will just select one of the questions in the registration form. So there were a couple of questions related to the role of the private sector and insurance in resilient recovery, and how can risk financing and insurance products enhance the effectiveness of resilient recovery. So would one of you like to answer this?
Shall I? I'll have a go at that. Others may want to add. Yeah, so I think insurance often comes up, obviously, when we're talking about recovery, and there's clearly a place for the insurance sector in recovery. Obviously, the insurance industry has a deep knowledge of risk and analysis and risk management expertise, and has a central role in guaranteeing economic development and financial might. So there's clearly a big piece of the puzzle here for this. But I think as we, in this increasingly uncertain world, with rapidly rising economic damages, these risk transfer solutions really need to be embedded in a broader and comprehensive disaster risk reduction context. I think just transferring risk, I think, is not sufficient anymore, and there needs to be far more steps for the insurance industry into really looking at the risk reduction piece and the adaptation piece, as well as the risk transfer piece. And there's been a lot of chat about this in the past, but still, I think our assessment is that DRR remains largely undervalued in insurance underwriting, asset management and risk management. And there are some structural barriers to doing this. So the reason it hasn't happened is because it's not easy. So 1 year underwriting cycles means that insurers have no incentives to invest in risk reduction measures when the client can switch insurers the next year. I think catastrophe models don't easily include adaptation measures within them. So there are some real issues there. But I think there's a real space for the insurance industry to step into this and to address this, because clearly this issue is not going away. The need to build in risk reduction adaptation is becoming more and more urgent, not less. So I think there's a real role for the insurance industry to step into that space. I think the Insurance Development Forum is a really good place for that discussion to happen, and for to really kind of pilot some different things, to kind of take forward to different measures. There are some fairly easy things to do around variable pricing of insurance to provide incentives for risk reduction. So there are some fairly easy things that can be done. And at the moment, this is happening occasionally, but not across the board. So yes, definitely a place for action, but not happening enough yet. Thanks.
Thank you, Debbie. And I think it really is an example of how resilient recovery is relevant throughout the entire DRM cycle and should be considered in all phases. I just heard that you should submit your questions throughout the Q&A and that hands might not be able to be raised. So we're still keeping an eye on the Q&A. But in the meantime, it would be very interesting to hear from you, Ron, or from Dharam on the role of the private sector. How does the UNDP work or stimulate the role of the private sector in recovery phases, and how does that work out at country level? I know that you've worked a little bit with private sector down in Nepal, so it would be very interesting to hear from you about that.
Thanks. Yeah, role of private sector is really essential in resilient recovery. So we have a couple of examples how private sector has been playing a key role in resilient recovery, particularly in the case of flood. In 2017 or before, we didn't have like the SMS alert system that goes to the communities prior to the disaster hit hard to them. And then after that, after 2000 flood, what we realized was this is really important to communicate risk to the communities. So linking physical science, we realize is really essential to link with the community or citizen science. So what we did was we built a partnership with private sector telecommunication as their corporate responsibilities, and then they start sending SMS alert to the risk exposed communities prior to the disaster. Though the lead time was something around 30 minutes to 6 hours, so 6 hours lead time is really adequate to protect communities' asset, lives, and livelihoods. So that is, if we consider the scenario of last 3 years. Nearly 3.5 million SMS were sent in 2020, and then 5.5 million SMS were sent in 2021, and then nearly 13 million SMS were sent in 2022, and 2023 record is yet to come. So this should be in a increasing trend. That is one example of role of private sector in risk communication. Second, insurance. We built partnership with Nepal's largest insurance company as a part of risk transfer. So we work. We realized FRMC approach through the FRMC approach that risk transfer is really essential if we really build community resilience. Then we developed a product, index-based flood insurance, but we cannot develop it alone in isolation. We built a partnership with the local, the Nepal's largest, insurance company. They build their product, and then the product is rolled out in 2022 in the flood-exposed area of Nepal. And then a number of interests are coming up from the communities to work on it, and private sector is a bit, jumping on it, just linking, how private sector work in insurance. And there are a couple of other examples from the private sector's role in resilient recovery. I think I stop here.
Thank you, Dan. We are almost going to close the webinar, but first I'd like to hear from you, Ron, in case you have any final responses, reactions to what has been discussed. Maybe in 1 minute, so that we also have some time for Debbie to provide some closing remarks.
Yeah, just real quickly. No, I think Debbie gave a very comprehensive reflection on this issue. I mean, one of the things certainly at UNDP, we're somehow engaged in the insurance space as well. I think that engagement. One of the things we really have been having a discussion internally on is this whole matter of incentivizing risk reduction through these types of insurance processes. I think it's a conversation that's been around for a long time, and we really need to get to the mechanics of what that could look like. And I think Debbie gave a very fulsome, exposure of what's behind that discourse. But I think if we look at the private sector just quickly, there is great opportunity for engagement in the private sector on the recovery preparedness front. If we're really getting innovative in understanding who owns most of the sort of exposure, right? One would say it's private enterprise. And so if we're looking at the impact of potential events and really getting into the application of scenario-based approaches and planning, the private sector then becomes a very integral player in understanding, what could be lost, and therefore how do we chart a way forward in building back better? How do we then bring and unlock their capital that's available into the space around how we finance recovery? So I think that's an area we need to probably look into a little bit more. And there's some other thoughts, but I know we're really up on time. It's a very interesting question that requires, I think, some more engagement in kind of teasing out some opportunities that may lie ahead. I'll stop there, Barbara.
Thank you, Ron. And I will now turn to Debbie for some quick closing remarks.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all the speakers. It has been really interesting. And I would like to summarize everything, but that would be impossible. So just a couple of things to underline, and then also just to look ahead to kind of what happens next on all of this. I guess just to restate that I think that recovery has somewhat fallen through the kind of policy and funding cracks. So we know that recovery is part of disaster risk reduction. It's a principle 4 of the Sendai framework. It's part of the humanitarian world. It's part of development world, part of climate under loss and damage, but it's not a priority in any of these sectors. And I think that is why, in most cases, Build Back Better is sadly a bit more catchphrase than commitment. So where do we go now? And I think obviously the new discussions on loss and damage in the climate space really open up now a space to have this discussion. So many of us will be looking to COP to kind of move forward to this discussion and to make sure that the new loss and damage fund, which should be operationalized at the next COP, has a specific space that that funding can go for resilient recovery. I think there are also linkages with adaptation, of course, because we are not only addressing loss and damage, but also trying to mitigate its impact. So there is definitely a link in with adaptation, which I don't think has really been made in the climate space. So and then I think just the other thing, I think it has been mentioned, and Karen mentioned it, that actually most recovery is funded through debt. And many countries are getting themselves deeper and deeper into debt as disaster follows disaster. So there's a real need for the major financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, other multilateral development banks to start rethinking how they fund recovery and really looking at this debt issue. And unfortunately, this was discussed a lot at the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF last week, but no real progress on this. The challenge is recognised. There's lots of talk about reform and evolution, and there were some small steps forward, but the far from structural responses to the problem. So there's a lot to do in that space as well. So I think in the next few months, let's make sure that we're all kind of proposing changes to really move forwards on recovery, both on the kind of debt issue and then also in the policy space and funding for loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie, and thanks to everyone who attended and participated in this webinar. I know we're 1 minute over time, so appreciate that you're still here. We'd like to close this session now. Obviously, we can follow up by providing you the links to the products, and we hope to engage with you. Contact us anytime about resilient recovery, because as you've heard, we like to talk about it. Thanks to all the speakers, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.